Hey guys, and welcome to this YouTube video where I show you how I created my river table with a Knight Rider theme step by step. As you can see here, the first step I took was to get a large sheet of polypropylene plastic. Polypropylene is a really good plastic to use when you're creating a river table because the epoxy doesn't adhere to it. So this is really well worth thinking about when you're looking to create a river table. So what I'm doing here is I'm just cutting off the excess that I don't need on the table itself. This is going to give me my upstands for the left and right hand sides and the front and the ends of the actual table itself. So I moved the table itself, or the polypropylene, onto a glass outdoor table that I knew was sturdy enough that it could take the weight of not only the wood itself, but also take the weight of the epoxy and anything I'm going to clamp it down with. Now the glass is great because it gives me that ultra flat surface, so I know that there was no undulations or bumps in the actual table itself. And what you can see on the table itself is a few chips for betting, for like roulette and tables. And what I did is I got a stack of 5 and I used some tape, non-adhesive tape, to give them like a little pack out so that it doesn't stick to the epoxy when I use them as like little clamps. So I'm just here, you can see, wiping down the underside of the table so that if there's any dust, I don't want that inside of the actual epoxy. And I used a little bit of methylated spirits just to get that off so there was no residue left. What I'm doing here is I'm just measuring up the actual length of the table, or the width of the table, to make sure that the river was of a certain depth and certain width. So what I'm doing here is I'm just measuring up the actual width of the table, or length, whichever way you want to look at it, just to make sure that I can clearly see how wide my river is going to be, so I can then work out whether I've got enough epoxy to go in there. So the first step for me was to, once I'd laid out the wood in the areas I wanted in, is to start to glue in using a glue gun the polypropylene boards and sides together so that there would be no escape of epoxy. This was a little bit of a cumbersome task, as I've only got a little glue gun and the little sticks were running out quite quickly. But please make sure, if when you go do this, is that you pay a lot of attention to the corners like I am here, because they're your weaker points. So if there is any runoff of your epoxy, they're going to come out on the corners. So I'm just here, I'm putting the final piece in because I did have a bit of an overlap on each of the upstands, and I did the classic measure 3 times, cut once, so I knew that it wasn't going to be too short. And then I came back in and made sure again just to measure it with a pencil, and then I went and cut it and it was just right. So I'm just putting that down here just so that I know that it fits in like a glove. Now what I did probably is a little bit overkill, but I went back after I'd done all of the gluing, just double checked, and then I moved the wood away from the actual upstands. Now some people have been putting some silicone into the other side of the upstands. What I did is I used the PTFE tape, that means that nothing will stick to it, and it's a fantastic thing when you're using epoxy. So this gave me another sort of extra bit of caution and seal so that I knew it wasn't going to leak out. And so I did it all around the edges, just moved the slabs out so that I could do and make sure that it was in the upstand part and also on the bottom part of the upstand itself. Really good tip here is just to use your fingernails just to push it right into that groove so you know that it's right in there. And then also, as I say, just make sure you do the upstand part as well. You really want to make sure that these are strong and that there's going to be no leakage of epoxy, because as we all know, epoxy is not cheap at the moment. So this process took me all of about 15-20 minutes to do, and a couple of times I went back and just made sure that it wasn't ruffled up. I don't want to push my slab up any further than I need to, and I just double checked that the width and the length was exactly the same, so it was still square. And as you can see here, I'm now moving on to the epoxy side of things. I did a little bit of mathematics just to make sure that I'm putting the right amount in. I only wanted to flood the bottom of the table with about 2 millimeters of epoxy here, just to use it as like a sealing in coat for the bottom. So I'm just putting in here the resin itself, and then I'll put the hardener on. I'm using the double bucket, or the actual triple bucket method, is suggested by a lot of people, where you measure your epoxy into 2 different vessels, then mix it into a third. So I was running a little bit short on the boxes themselves, or the pots themselves, so I can't remember if I did it on this one, I just used the 2 pots and poured them into one. Now I'm not going to show you how long I mixed this by hand, but I went for about 5 to 10 minutes mixing this in together, just to make sure that it was 100% mixed in. We don't want to have bits of epoxy that aren't curing properly just because they're not mixed together properly. So yeah, as you can see, I'm just draining it out of one bucket and making sure that I'm getting all of it together. And actually in this step you can see I've got the 3 buckets. So what I did was, just that final bucket there, I'm going to pour in the resin into that third bucket, just to give it another little stir, just to make sure that it really was 100% mixed together. Something you might have spotted already is I'm using my kitchen scales to make sure I can measure the accurate amount of epoxy that needs to go into the actual buckets. A little tip for you, if you are using your own personal home scales and the wife is not noticing the scales have gone missing and you don't want to get in trouble for damaging them, I put mine inside of a little lock seal bag, just so that I knew that if any epoxy went over it, it's not going to bust up the actual scales themselves. So as you can see here, I'm just emptying the epoxy onto the table now, and onto the polypropylene table area, and I'm just moving it around with my hand just to randomly put it into the locations where I want it to be. I'm not too worried about it at this point, because I do know that this surface is flat and level, as I measured it earlier on, but also this is going to be the underside of the actual table, so all I'm doing here is essentially just sealing in the bottom part of the slab once it goes in. So I'm just emptying out the bucket there. Always think of where you're going to be putting this, the empty buckets and pieces, because as I found that you end up tripping over the buckets when you're trying to do certain bits. So here you can see I'm just moving a heat gun across the epoxy just to get rid of any bubbles that I may have created when I was doing the mixing process for 10 to 15 or even 5 to 10. And then I'm going to move on to putting the slab back into the mould itself. I went with the sort of bottom end going in first, and then sort of pushed it down slowly, and then just made sure that it was as close up to the edge as I could get. Now as you can see, I'm wearing some safety glasses. Epoxy can be a bit dangerous if you get it in your eyes, so just make sure you've got the right PPE on. And here you can see I'm just pushing the last part of the slab in, and just going back over the edges of the slab where I've got a little bit of excess on the slab, on the actual epoxy. When I put the slabs down, I'm just moving this across the edges of the river, just so that I can then put a little bit of a coat on there. This should reduce the amount of micro bubbles that come out when we do the pours later on. So I'm just moving it over the edges of the grain and just moving it up to the top, just so I know that I can reduce that micro bubble issue when it comes to it later on. Now these slabs were lovely because there was actually a couple of branches that were falling out of the middle of it, and there was kind of like a little lump and bump in the middle just as I'm getting to where I've got the heat gun now, and it's made a little like island, so when I poured the final parts of the epoxy, it really did pop. So I'm just going back over here with the heat gun now. I've done the edges just to make sure that there are any bubbles that are popping out, that they do go, so I don't ruin the table itself. And you can see there are my betting chips. I'm just putting them underneath a couple of little slabs just to hold them down. Now this is where I ran into my first problem when I started to do this river table. Having never done one before, something I completely didn't expect to happen was when I did the second pour with all of the colour of the river, the actual epoxy itself got quite hot. Now I didn't go over the exceeding amounts to do the actual thickness of the middle of the river. I was under the recommended size and depth. However, it did get quite hot and I had to put a fan under the table. Thankfully the glass was drawing and dissipating the heat a little bit more, but what I did notice was even with the clamps, the table decided to cup a little bit. Not massive amounts, but enough to be noticeable. So as you can see here, I'm just putting the braces across the table itself, and this is going under the actual glass table with a bit of metal and just pinning them down, and I thought that would be enough and appropriate for me. Clearly it did some of the job, just to stop the actual slab from floating on top of the epoxy. However, it didn't stop the cupping. So I'm using some G-clamps here just to push that piece of wood down, and you can probably notice just in the top left hand side of the actual slab, the epoxy is starting to ooze over the top, coming up from underneath over the top of the slab at the back. Now I did get a heat gun just to just pop some more micro bubbles that I'd noticed pop up where I had obviously pushed down on the slabs with this brace. He's pushing some of the air out, and I just wanted to get rid of that. But also I put the heat gun across the areas where I'd rubbed it into the side of the actual slabs, just to again make sure that there are no micro bubbles in that. Any of the excess that did pop up from the edges, I'm just sliding that back into the actual river area just to fill that out, and then I started to drag that across. Once I got to the B stage, I decided that I'd move on to adding the colour to the middle of the river. So here again you can see me measuring out the epoxy and the hardener, and I won't bore you again with the mixing method, but it took a lot of mixing this one, so I'm just going to skip forward. So I was quite surprised how much epoxy I used in this stage. There was quite a considerable amount that went into just doing the middle of the river. Now I used 3 different colours of glitter, shimmer, I suppose you can call it epoxy powder. I went for a series of blues and like an ivory silver colour, just to give it a bit of difference in the pop. I mixed this first of all into the actual epoxy first before I went in with hardener, and just made sure that there was enough of the colouring in there that it wasn't too transparent. I do want a little bit of the colour to pop through on the table, so I added a little bit as I went through. Just keep adding as you need it. It's better to, as my mum always used to say, it's better to add rather than to take away. So we kept on adding some blues and some silvers, and I was quite happy with how much colour has gone through it. So I started to add the hardener to the actual epoxy, and as you can see here, I'm mixing and mixing again. What I also did do though, as I was getting to the point where I was mixing the whole lot together, I had a little bit of a stop and got a little cup to make sure that I could see the depth of the actual epoxy when it's poured, and to see how much light was coming through it, because I could then add some more colour or glitter if I needed to, if it was a little bit too transparent. So as you can see here, I'm just adding the little cup to pour some in. I'm checking the cup against the actual river itself to see how much and how deep it is, and then try to measure out how much epoxy I have in the cup, just to see. And then I held it up to the light just to see how much light I could see through it, and I was pretty happy with the actual outcome of what I got to. So we went for the pour. I did start the pour at one end, and I pushed that all the way through to the end, and it was quite a pleasing and pleasurable thing to do actually. I did enjoy seeing the epoxy flowing down the middle of the river and then hitting the back end, and then all of the swirls and the colours that were coming up with it. Now this is a deep pour epoxy. This is the Glass Cast 1050, and it's a nice product to work with. When you do something with epoxy, always check your epoxy guidelines. Some say measure by weight, some say measure by volume, and also they tell you how much you can pour in one go. Don't be scared to maybe contact the provider, because you can find that when you pour the epoxy, if it is too deep, the exothermic reaction that can happen can result in your epoxy setting too quick, and you can have cracks, and it can actually get hot enough that it can cause other issues with the heat. So just be careful, make sure you read the instructions. So once I poured, I just started to go through with a little tongue depressor thing, little lollipop stick, and just add some swirls to the epoxy itself. Now this felt like a bit of a silly thing to do at this stage, because the epoxy, because it's deep pour, will require me to come back and do this a few times over. However, I just wanted to see what it looked like, and I went back over with a heat gun just to make sure that I was getting out the micro bubbles. Now I'm going to be honest with you, I didn't get rid of all of the micro bubbles, and I should have maybe come back and done this a few more times during the curing process, but this was my first rivet table, so I did learn from that. Now, because this was a slab that, or when I did the pour and it did get quite hot, I did notice that when I came back and looked at where I did my swirls before and then added new swirls, that they were gone, and the actual epoxy itself had done almost like a bubbling effect, which gave a really great effect in the actual epoxy when it's set. So as you can see here, that's how we got to just before. Now you can see I've not put the epoxy all the way up to the edge of the slab. I wanted to keep some of the groove of the slabs itself exposed, so that I would then put a clear epoxy over, so you can see the actual beauty of the wood, but also get the nice element of the epoxy running through. So what we did after this was that we went back and we sealed up the wood with some more epoxy on the top. So I did like a rough coat of epoxy just to make sure that there were no additional bubbles coming through. So here you can see the final state of the actual epoxy after it cured, and it's very different to how it was when I first poured it. So what I'm doing here is, I'm just getting a little bit of epoxy just so that I can close off the wood and hopefully reduce any chance of any micro bubbles coming out when we start to do the bigger pours across the top of the actual rivet table itself. Also, what I am doing here is I'm just filling up the middle of the river just to make sure that I am flush to the top with the epoxy and the wood, to really show off and pop that curve on the edge of the slab as well. Now when I was rubbing in the epoxy, it really popped the grain of this lovely redwood slab, and it was really nice to see the colour that came out of it. As you can see also as well, there is a nice two-tone to the actual wood itself, where I've got a nice bit of like piney looking colour on the edge, and then it hits the red, as well as the knots that are in there. Now the knots, I actually used another epoxy product just to fill the holes in the knots, and I found that epoxy product actually didn't set that well, so I chose to move over to the glass cast range. What I was finding was the epoxy, as it cured and as I poured it and it cured, it went all rubbery. I think the pot that I'd got, or the actual lot that I had, maybe had gone over its use by date, so I didn't push too much, and I didn't want to sort of experiment with that when it came to doing the river on the main table. So we cut our losses, and we went with the glass cast. As you can see, once the epoxy had poured, I went back over with a heat gun just again to knock those micro bubbles out. Inevitably, because this is just a bit of a seal coat, there will be bubbles that pop up, but I will be going back over with a sander just to get rid of those holes, and we're probably going to do a couple of coats over the top of this and then a flood coat. So as you can see here, once I'd done that, there is a nice shine. I still was slightly lower than being flush through the river with the actual epoxy, but I really loved how the wood looked once I put the epoxy on top of the slab, and I was really getting excited to see what was actually being built in front of me. Something to spot here is you can see that when you do pour the epoxy, even though this is a deep pour, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a flat surface when it pours. You will get some areas that get a little bit more epoxy than the others, but this is where you're going to make sure that when you do your sanding that you try and sand a bit more down, and we will be putting more epoxy and it will start to level out, but when we do our final sand polish, should get it to a nice flatness. So as you can see here, I have gone through the sanding process, and I've also sanded the river, just so that I can get what's known as a mechanical bond between the epoxy layers themselves. And what I'm doing here is, I'm just going to put enough epoxy down to fill up the middle of the river, and also to start to coat the top a little bit better. So I've kind of done a different pouring method here. I put the epoxy and the hardener together in one pour together, sort of combining the cups into one bucket, and then give it a good stir. And then I started to pour through the middle of the river first, and then over the top. Now I did find that I probably gave myself a little bit less epoxy here than I maybe should have. So I was kind of trying to make it stretch a little bit. So what I wanted to do is just sort of fill up the holes, fill up the river to level, and then I could always add some more if I needed to. So I'm just pushing the epoxy around with one of the tongue depressors that I had. And again, once you put the epoxy on top of the epoxy that's been sanded, that shine and the redwood really pops out again. And it was nice to work with this piece of wood. I really enjoyed it. So once I pushed it all around the table, I came back over again. As with most of the stages, put a bit of a heat across it using a heat gun, just to get rid of any micro bubbles that might have popped up. I did spend a bit more time on the river here, just to making sure that the river didn't have any in there, because obviously this is going to be the focal point of the table. And yeah, just went as a methodical way, just getting all the bubbles out. So once all of that had been done, I decided that I was going to give it another sand, just so that I can then put another coat over the top. I left these sides on at this stage because I thought if I'm going to put another coat over the top, at least I know that it's not going to spill everywhere, and I could get it some part flat. Now you can see here I'm spending a bit of time on this area because it did seem to pool a little bit. I was a little bit unlucky. I think one of the chocks that I had underneath the table had moved, so I did have a slight uneven surface on the actual table with the epoxy. So I went back over with the sander just to get that a little bit flatter and spend a bit more time on that end, so that when I did come back and do the next round of epoxy, that it did have some part of a level playing field. So once I've done the sanding, just make sure, if you do it, make sure you can get rid of as much of the dust and this any sort of epoxy resin that might be floating around out of the environment. I am wearing a mask here, you can see that. I tried my best to make sure that I had all of the doors open and the ventilation and the fans kicking all of the dust out. Not really something you want to be breathing in. So this is after I've done a last little flood coat on top, and here I'm taking off the actual side upstands of the polypropylene. Now you can see how easy this comes away from the slab itself. The ends here, because I put the glue quite thickly on, I had to kind of get something to just prise that off, but actually the epoxy didn't stick to it and these came off really clean. Now this is a slab that's going to go on top of a sit stand table that I bought myself, as this is going to be kind of my office stroke YouTube desk. So it was actually quite handy that I'd built the actual table itself before I started doing the building of the actual table itself, because it meant that I can move it around my little area. I haven't got a big office area here. It's 4 meters by 4 meters, and it meant that I could move the actual table around and also elevate it if I needed to, or drop it down if I needed to get stuff off. So I'm just removing the final upstand here just before I then start to do what every child, I suppose, wants to do, is look at how it looks from the bottom of the actual table, because obviously that's got the full nice shiny glass bit on the bottom where we pushed the actual wood down, and we want to see what it looks like with the light going through the river itself. So I'm just putting a bit of pressure down onto the polypropylene here, and as you can see, it just comes away so nicely that I didn't have to do anything. I didn't have to hit it. I've seen a lot of YouTubers using melamine tables or melamine boards and with tuck tape. This way I would highly recommend, if you can get hold of polypropylene boards. They are slightly expensive, but as you see there, that took me all of 2 minutes just to pry off at the bottom of the table. So I'm just moving the tape that I put on the edges. Some of it had got caught up in the epoxy. I'm just pulling that out of the edges here, and I'm not too bothered about if I can't get some bits off, because I am going to be running a router across the edge just to give me a nice straight edge and a nice curved edge as well on some of them. Just a word of warning, when you do pull anything off of your table, the epoxy can leave a little bit of residue or a little sharp edge, so when you are running your hands across it, just be careful, because it can be quite sharp. It did catch me out once, but yeah, just be careful as you're pulling off your polypropylene boards and your upstands. Now here you can see I'm starting the Knight Rider style with a rabbit tool, just to start to groove into, or cut a groove into, the actual table itself. I did find that this was catching a little bit, so the rabbit tool actually allowed me to get a nice straight edge or an even cut across the side of the slab. And then what I did is I used my reciprocating multi-tool again, just to cut into the wood where I need it to go, but I kept on going back with my trunking, because the trunking is going to contain my LED strips, of which I'm going to be using the addressable LED strips to do that. Here you can see the joys of having the high-low table. I can actually move it up and I can start cutting into the slab itself. Now I did it in this step, in this order, because I thought, as redwood it can be quite soft, if I've obviously got the epoxy on the top and on the side and on the bottom, that might give me a bit more stability when I'm doing this cut inside of the wood, so that when I do use a chisel and a hammer just to cut out the middle bit so I can recess in, I know that I'm not going to snap, or I'm not going to have any problems with the actual tops or bottom of the table itself. So here you can see where, after I've done the multi-tool, I'm just going through with my chisel and my hammer just to knock out the excess wood that I don't need. And I did come back to it a few times just to make sure that my trunking would fit quite nicely into the actual groove, of which I was quite happy with. Now towards the end I did find that there was a bit of a knot in the edge of the table. I didn't want to do too much here, so I'm doing a little bit at a time, and I will go back through this with my multi-tool just to sort of saw away a little bit and give it a nice straight edge. So as you can see, I'm just moving my camera across here, where you can see that I've now got a nice even groove across the center of the table, ready for the trunking to go in there with the actual LEDs. I did go back in with the multi-tool just to make sure that it was nice inside, rather than having chipped bits of wood here and there. And obviously once I'm happy with that, I will do my flood coat across the top, just so that I can have a nice piece of wood exposed, or if I've chipped it like I have, and just a little bit, that I can make sure I can cover up with the actual epoxy. So now I've done the epoxy and the flood coat. I didn't record that, unfortunately. I'm now moving on to the final stages, and I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Something you don't see when it comes to watching the videos of people doing YouTube on these slabs is there's a lot of waiting around for either the epoxy to cure, or you might find that actually some stages you think they look like they'll only take you 15 minutes, but actually they take you a couple of hours. This sanding was one of them. Now, I did start off with, I think it was a 60 or 80 grit sandpaper, just to sort of take off the top ends of any peaks that were on the epoxy. And I used a process that I'd seen on a YouTube channel from actually the provider of the epoxy, Glasscast, where you go in one direction when you do your sanding, and then do it across the sanding area. So and they recommend that you do 4 passes on the first bit, and then you start to do work your way through the grits. Now, as you can see in the background there, I have got a few stacks of different graded sandpapers on this sanding machine. It was really useful to have a hoover attachment as well, and I've kind of used a bit of gaffer tape to tape that to the exhaust part of the orbital sander. But also I would advise, again, just because you're sanding, you're kicking up a lot of dust, make sure you put a mask on just so that you're covering yourselves. And yeah, this actually took quite a considerable amount of time. I actually went from the 60 and 80 grit up to 2000 grit, and then I moved on to a polishing compound. But the actual outcome of doing this sanding is it's phenomenal. When you run your hand across the table, it's almost like you're just running your hand across glass, and the final product that comes out of it is absolutely fantastic. And spending that time doing the sanding is well worth it. So what I would also advise you as well, when you are doing the sanding, if you start to see what look like little pigtails, that's not something you want to have happening. That's probably because either your sanding paper has got clogged, or you need to replace your sanding paper. So actually, when I was doing this sanding, I went through probably 4 or 5 pads on the 60 or 80 grit, and then probably the same through when I went through 120 to 200 and so on. It's well worth just there. I think I paid £10 for a pack of 100 different sandpapers. It's not much money, but it's worth it because the product that you get out of the end of it is much better for changing those pads, rather than trying to sort of let one get through and then knocking out any dust inside that's got clogged. The sander I'm using here is a Von Horst, I think it is, which I bought off of Amazon, and actually it was a really good deal. I think I paid something like £35-40. I'll pop the link in the bottom of the description for you. It's a really good adjustable speed orbital sander. It also comes with the polishing sponges as well, which really sort of drew my attention to it, knowing that I was going to be doing some polishing compound on this. So yeah, as you can see here, I'm going backwards and forwards, sideways, up and down, just to make sure that I'm going through the cycle of doing the actual sanding. And then just make sure you go across the edges as well. So you can see there, I'm just changing the pad over again. And then when you move between the papers, what I would advise you to do is just get a damp cloth, just to wipe off the dust, so that when you go back on and do the next grade, you are doing it onto the epoxy rather than just sort of going over the top of dust. You can see how quickly it dries, and you can see how well you've done. I have seen on other YouTube channels where they have got a permanent marker as well, and they've swirled the permanent marker over the top of the epoxy. It's a good indicator to see if you're going over a space enough of an area, whether you're doing enough of a pass or not. I was a bit cautious about doing that on mine, because obviously this is my first time of doing this, and I thought my luck would be that I'd end up hitting the wood, and if I'd drawn all over the wood, it might actually stain the wood or do something to it. So I was a little bit cautious. So I went through all the grades of the sandpaper, as I said, and then I got down to the polishing compound, which was fantastic, and this is the finish that you get. So as you can see, there's my Knight Rider LEDs that are pulsing away. I will show you how to do that in another video. And it's recessed into the actual table. I did leave it a little bit proud so that you could see like a little box at the top. But I think you'll agree that actually the contrast and the colours in the wood with the epoxy really makes this table pop, and it's something that I'm really happy that I've done, and I'm so pleased that I had the time to do this.